We are going to move into our work session now.
I did do a presentation. It's more slides than I anticipated. I apologize for that. I just want to level set for a second, if that's okay. So we're going to talk about school funding and all the things. There's a lot going on right now, guys. A lot going on.
And we asked Carrie Dennis
Yeah.
and Scott Reeves to join us as we talk about some of the potential accounts that Nicole's going to discuss. So if you have any questions.
Yeah, so if you remember, we had a conversation as part of the May forecast, talk about transfers and to talk about levies and different things like that. So I promised that I would bring back some more specific things. So these are the more specific things. So I'm going to ask you to take one and pass it down if you don't mind. I'm going to go through this presentation before we go over this large spreadsheet here. So I just want to remind everybody that the cost of education in Ohio is a shared responsibility between the state and the local community. I'm actually interviewed with NBC4 today, and I stressed that very fact, and that we are just asking the state to do its part in the cost of education. And so when we look at our state share, that percentage overall, this is a heat map from the Department of Education and Workforce that shows the change in the state share percentage from last fiscal year, 24, to this fiscal year, 2025. This is where we are right there in the middle. So we saw a decrease actually of 7%. So that's a decrease of 5% or more. So last year, this biennium budget, we've seen the school funding formula keep what does the cost to educate a student, what does that cost? The same for both years, but it continues to update those local wealth capacities. How wealthy is our local community? What is that state and local share percentages? And so we've seen our state share drop, but the costs stay the same. So this year alone, from last year to this year, we lost $4 million in state formula funding, even though we gained over 100 students on the formula funding with the enrollment for the formula funding. So that's the conversation we continue to have with the state to make sure that they understand how their decisions are impacting us. This is where we are in the state budget process. So we have the executive budget, that's the governor's version, we have the House's version. And you know what? We actually have the Senate's proposed version. They are expected to vote on that on Wednesday, I believe. We will see. So whatever, right now we have their proposed budget. They had hearings last week in the Senate Finance Committee to go over that proposal. Thank you, President Meyer, for testifying. I apologize that I couldn't be there. They were supposed to have amendments by Friday. And so we should see something maybe tomorrow for whatever that final version is that would be introduced in the Finance Committee to be voted out of committee to go to the full House on Wednesday. So then we're looking at this conference committee, and this is where we have a lot of those closed door discussions. Those are already happening now, I can tell you. So conference committee is where we'll have members of the House, members of the Senate come together and reconcile the differences between the state's budget process to get it to the governor's desk by June 30th for signature so it can become law by July 1st to meet the state's operating budget needs for the beginning of the fiscal year. State funding for public, so this is statewide. During the DeRolf decision, our school funding model was ruled unconstitutional, first in 1997 and 3 more times after that in the early 2000s. But during that first DeRolf decision, the state was picking up about 42% of that cost statewide. Today, they're picking up about 38% of that cost.
I have a quick question on that. So the DeRolf decision, the original came down in 97. It was ruled unconstitutional several times thereafter. Was there ever a school funding formula that was ruled constitutional?
No. No, and if you read the last decision, judges basically said, you need to fix your funding formula. We're not going to hear this anymore because it's the same thing over and over again. And it was ruled unconstitutional due to the over-reliance on local property taxes and residual budgeting by the state. And when we talk about residual budgeting, we're talking about the state is prioritizing funding, and then schools get basically a dollar amount that's not based on any need.
It's just what's left
It's
over.
just what's left over, essentially.
Okay.
So that's where we've been. And I have a slide I didn't include here, but I have a couple of slides where I show all of the different iterations of school funding models that we've had since the 90s, since the Duralf decision. And every 2 years, we go through the state budget process and have this conversation with state lawmakers. And, I like to remind people that our lawmakers, they are not experts in school funding. They're not experts in property taxes, even though some of them like to think that they are. But there's a lot that they don't know and how a lot of these things have worked. And even if they did work in school funding or worked in property taxes in some space prior to getting in the legislature, a lot of things have changed over that same time period, right? So I view our role to just make sure that we are educating the legislators so that they can understand how their decisions will impact the 15,000 students that we educate here in Westerville and our local community. And so that's why we continue to have these conversations every couple of years. So that's where we are. Under the governor's proposal, he continued to update those local wealth calculations, did continue the Fair School Funding Plan, but kept that base cost the same at those 2022 amounts. So under the governor's proposal, we will have lost about $6.9 million over the biennium. This is an old slide. We've had that before. So our current state share is 23%. That's projected to be 11% by the end of the biennium. Based on our local wealth capacity estimates. The House's proposal, the House introduced this notion of a clawback or a cap on our general fund balance, and this only would apply to school districts. It doesn't apply to other local governments in the budget bill. They introduced this clawback provision that would essentially claw back anything over 30% of our preceding year's expenses for our general fund balance. So under the House's version, we were looking at about $110 million to lose over the fiscal year 26 and 27 because it would be for tax year 25.
Can we go back one slide? I just
Sure.
have one question here. So when you look at the local wealth calculations, I just want to be super clear here for everyone. This is about property wealth, right?
Property and income.
Yeah, property and income wealth, and there's a I don't know what the formula is or how that's calculated. Because I think one of the things that we hear a lot from folks is that I've lived in my house for 50 years. I can't afford this anymore. So there is a component of it that's looking at income, but it's not doing that in any, it's obvious, but it's not in any way, shape, or form on an individual basis, really.
No,
I mean,
it's just looking in aggregate overall for our entire school district footprint. What is our property wealth? So as property values increase, we look wealthier as a community. And on the property value side, we look wealthier as a community, but all of our voted levies are subject to House Bill 920 reduction factors. So we don't see growth on those those voted levies. And so our only option is to go back to the community and ask them for another levy if we need growth in our revenue. And so on the income side, so it's a 60-40 split in the calculations,
Okay.
so 40% for personal income and then 60% for property wealth. But it also takes that and compares us to the other 600 plus traditional public schools, and then it calculates based relative to the other 600 plus public schools. And so at the end of the day, I want to make sure that it's very clear to our community and really everyone that the cost of education is a shared responsibility. We are always going to have that local share That's never going to go away regardless of the outcome of the state budget, because that's how it's set in our constitution, in our state constitution. But we have historically been underfunded based on every formula that the state's had. We've historically been a capped district, and we've never been fully funded from the state for what their portion is, for as far back as I have records to look at this. But we're always going to have that state and local share split overall. Yeah, but it doesn't take into account
Cost of living being higher
The
here.
cost
So if
of
you think
living.
about central
Right,
Ohio,
yeah.
property
Yeah.
values and incomes are higher, but
The
so
cost
is the
of living
cost
is
of living.
higher.
So
Yeah.
that's where we're not seeing the balance piece, and it is really
It kind of treats
hard.
all of us like we're the same, but it looks at our different student demographics for different funding pieces and things like that, but not the cost of living.
If you think of other parts of the state and what you would buy
Sure.
the same property for. So
Yeah.
that's why our percentage continues to drop.
Yeah, thank you for stepping back to walk through that, just because I think, and I'm just speaking for me, but as a board member, when I hear that, like, I absolutely understand, but like, we are only given so many tools to come up with our share,
Yeah.
and so we're sort of get backed into a corner where when the state is reducing their share, we do not have a lot of options.
Yeah, so, I mean, our options, we can't charge for our services. We, free appropriate public education, that's the rule. And our options are, if we can't have additional revenue that keeps up with inflation, then we have to make reductions to our programs and services to students. There's only so many supplies and materials and things like that that you can reduce before you start impacting people and services to students. So, I mean, that's the conversation that we have to continue to have as we're not seeing our revenues keep up with our inflationary increases and expenses.
And we're not allowed to decide not to spend money on students who choose not to attend our schools. There are things we have to provide for them, like the payment in lieu
Yes.
of transportation.
Yeah, there's a lot of, we like to call those unfunded mandates, yes.
Thank you.
So the House's proposal, that's where we first heard about the clawback. So this was essentially the net effect of the House's proposed budget. So the House's proposal sunsetted the fair school funding formula that we've had for the last two bienniums, and basically just added an additional $20 per pupil in '26 and $30 per pupil in '27. So about $687,000 over the biennium for us. But that clawback piece, the state reimburses us for some old tax levies, voted levies prior to 2013 for homeowners. And losing those tax levies through that clawback would also would reduce the state reimbursements that we get. And it's all very complicated, but essentially that would be another $10 million loss that the state is currently paying for that they would not have to pay for in the future. So the Senate's proposal, they kept the clawback provision. Did you have a question?
I was just going to ask you if you could dig a little deeper on that, just so people out in the audience or that are watching, when you mean like the 10, we lose an
Yeah, so prior to 2013, any levy voted in prior to 2013, the state paid for 10% of that for all property owners at the 10% rollback. And then there was an additional 2.5% owner occupancy credit. So 12.5%, if you own your home, you live in your home, you occupy it, you saw a 12.5% reduction. The state exempted you from paying that, but then the state reimburses the schools for that lost revenue. That went away on all new levies after beginning in November of 2013. And so if the state essentially passes a law that reduces our old voted levies, and then we have to pass new levies, those new levies don't have that reimbursement attached to it. So every new levy for a homeowner after 2013 was 12.5% more expensive. And and because the state was no longer picking up that tab. And I mean, call me cynical, but I feel like some of this might be a way for the state to get away from paying that portion of the local property taxes that they've been historically paying for. It comes up every budget cycle. So I feel like maybe that might be a piece to this and what they're doing. So the Senate's proposal that just came out would be, would require the county budget commission to claw back 50%. So instead of 30%, they bumped it up to 50%. Still conversations about that. I would love to see that go away, and all of the amendments that are that came in on Friday. So we'll see what comes from the Senate side of things. And then the state funding formula, I don't have the detailed calculations with their, the Legislative Services Commission put out simulations for districts. But essentially what they put out in the simulations, we would lose about $426,000 over the biennium. And with that clawback, we would also have that potential loss in state reimbursements as well, along with the clawback. And I do just want to point out this whole cash cap or clawback. There are a lot of legislators right now that are referring to this as immediate tax relief for all Ohioans. And that's just simply a misstatement, because this wouldn't affect every school district. And the consequence, I guess, the outcome of this means you will see districts around the state that haven't been on the ballot in decades, that will need to immediately be on the ballot for new operating funds. And so, regardless of what you think of Westerville and what our situation is, this is impacting statewide. And we also have a lot of things that I think will have a lot of unintended consequences if something like this goes through, which I want to talk a little bit about. Are you going to say something?
I was going to ask, so they're touting this as property tax relief. Do we have any idea, like district to district, if they do these clawbacks, what the property owners are actually going to receive back, when they would receive it back? Because I can't imagine it's going to be you're not going to get a check for thousands of dollars.
No. So there's been a few county auditors that have said that it would be a minimal amount that any property owner would actually see.
And it would be more they wouldn't collect the next year versus here's a refund check.
Yeah.
But our
would be
concern
minimal.
too is just the instability
Yeah.
of,
Oh,
so
yeah.
people are going to be very confused because they would have this very temporary reprieve and then it would go right back on. And so, concerns about people not understanding that. And then we're trying to pass levies and they think we've just hit them with a new levy when it's really our levy we already had.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, it's also my understanding, so correct me if I'm wrong here, but they are saying essentially this is property tax relief, right? We'll have to actually go back to our property owners and say, we actually need more money, but they look like the good guys. And then they're putting restrictions on us around levies too. So essentially, I mean, they have all the great talking points, but they're squeezing school districts, public education across the state.
Yeah, and I think, we always talk about with the state's budget process, there's always winners and losers, right? You have some schools that are winners of a state budget process and some schools that are losers of the state budget process. And I like to remind our legislators that our students are continually losers of the state's budget process. There hasn't been a state budget in recent years that has where Westerville School students has been a winner on the winning end of whatever those calculations look like. And I mean, we have continued to be underfunded. And they're applying, so we have districts around the state, over 400 of them, that are at that 20 mil floor. So there's a provision in state law that says House Bill 920 works for school districts to reduce that millage until they get to 20 mils. We're well above that. We're nowhere near that 20 mil floor. But for those 400 plus districts, if their values went up by 35%, the residents' taxes went up by 35%. But that's not us. We don't, but they're treating us all like we're all in the same situation, and we're not. And that's what we try to educate them, that we're not on the same.
Well, we say that we're being underfunded, specifically with the Fair School funding plan. That plan calculated the amount that it costs to educate a child based on actual costs of educating the child, not, well, we only have this much money left over, let's just divvy it up, correct?
Right. So in theory, yes, that's the idea behind the Fair School funding formula. When it was first implemented in 2022, so it was for the 2022 and 2023 biennium, we were funded for both of those years based on what does it cost to educate a student in 2018.
True.
So now we're in 24 and 25, and so for this biennium, we've been compensated based on what does it cost to educate a student in 2022.
Yeah.
But then on top of that, we have all of those categorical add-ons. So we're just talking about those base costs, 2022 cost sets. The state has done studies for special education, for gifted education, for career tech education, economically disadvantaged, all of those things. They did those costs and studies in 2022. We're still waiting on the one for the disadvantaged pupils, the economically disadvantaged. The state hasn't released that yet. We were supposed to have that in December of 24. Still don't have that. But they have those cost studies from 2022, and they can see that those categoricals are severely underfunded. We've been focusing on special education. I have a slide to show that. But so we have those categoricals haven't been updated. We're using old base cost inputs, and then we're only funding a portion of the overall formula. So right now we're at 67% roughly. Yeah. And so it's we're underfunded on several levels overall.
So ideally, the cost would be whatever it costs, ideally this year to educate a child. If not this
Or at
year,
least
then
last
last
year.
year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the
That-
state has all that data. We
Yes.
send our data to them weekly.
Yeah.
They have all of our
And
data.
they'd be funding the formula at the 100%, which was the plan
Yeah.
for this biennium, but they're kind of going back on that.
It was meant to be phased in over 6 years.
Okay.
If I could, just on the underfunded piece, it's really just underscoring what the two of you are just talking about, which is that when we say that the state is underfunding, that is not us deciding how much we think we need to spend on students. This is the complex calculations in the Fair School funding formula, and the state, it's a shared responsibility, so we understand they're not going to fund 100% of, when we say 100%, that means 100% of their share.
Right.
They're not going to fund 100% of educating every child.
Right.
We have to do our part, but we should really be able to figure out what it should cost to educate a kid in Ohio. That's what the whole effort was for. So if the cost inputs are updated and so on, everybody should know what a reasonable amount is to educate a child, and you bring the categoricals in, looking at your
They worked
district.
with the American Institute for Research for
Right.
those cost studies.
Yeah.
They have reports on the Department of Education and Workforce's website.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so what we're seeing is the state does know, but when we say underfunding, it's really easy to gloss by that word. I'm glad you pulled it out. They know how much it should cost, and they are, in our case, just deciding to pass it on to the local taxpayers. So I just want to make that clear. We are not making those numbers up.
So Nicole, really quick, and not to belabor the point, but can you tell us how much we've been underfunded since 2020 or 2021?
Yeah, so we had calculated that just over $29 million just since 2021, which would have been the year before the Fair School funding plan came into place. And we were getting much closer to actually being funded, at least what the formula calculates. We're not even funded what the formula calculates at this point because of that phase-in process. And so, you know, when you hear conversations from legislators about they don't want to fund empty desks or, you know, whatever that looks like, I don't know how they can have that conversation about any school district in Ohio, even schools that have lost significant enrollment, if they've not ever fully funded a formula and updated all of the cost inputs and the categoricals and all that. So I will say that is something that the Senate had a lot of conversations about, and the Senate's proposal does include continuing guaranteed amounts for school districts, but based on 2021 levels, which is net 2021 levels, but it's net of all of the deductions we had at that time for private and charter schools. So it's that's a whole nother conversation that isn't really relevant right now, but it's I think at the end of the day, there was a lot of research that went into the Fair School Funding Plan. I think it's important that we're able to maintain that formula. I think that we can eventually get to a place to where our funding formula meets the state's responsibility. We just need the legislature to kind of see that vision when we talk about, you know, educating Ohio's children and what we want for the future of Ohio. And we want every kid, regardless of their zip code, to have an honest opportunity at life. I think that it's important that the legislators think about that and have those conversations.
I think it's also really important to remember that this was a bipartisan developed plan with professionals in this field, rather than just saying, here's what we have left over. This doesn't work. We're just going to throw it out.
So the Senate's proposal does continue the Fair School funding formula, continuing at those 2022 cost inputs and whatever other calculations. They also added something for performance, what they talk about funding for outcomes, for if you were a 4 or 5 star district, and also if you saw growth in your progress measures and all of that on the report card, there was some additional dollars for that. So we meet both of those, but somehow we're still being reduced over the biennium. And I think it has to do because our state share is going to continue to be updated. And then there's a change with the Disadvantaged Pupil Impact Aid, which is the categorical funding for our economically disadvantaged students. Right now, our students are counted based on free and reduced lunch applications that we do through food service, and that's how they're coded in our student information system. The Senate's version is doing something about moving us to a direct certification from the county, which would reduce the overall economically disadvantaged number, which I think would reduce that Disadvantaged Pupil Impact Aid over the biennium for us. Again, haven't seen any detailed calculations, just reading the language of the 5,500 plus page.
Is this also still assuming the 2022 cost inputs?
Yes. Yeah, it still continues the 2022 cost inputs. I stopped working. It's not working, Jennifer. My pointer works. It's a Google slide that might have froze up on us. Thank you. So just a reminder, the Auditor State introduced financial health indicators for school districts and talks about the larger the reserve, the better the entity is able to absorb in the short term, the impact of sudden revenue loss or significant increases in operating costs. And then cautionary outlook. So if our fund balance represents less than 6 months or 50% of current year revenues, And so the Senate is proposing 50% of current year expenses. Revenues and expenses aren't that far from each other, so, and that talks about a decline over the last 3 periods. So that's what's happening on the auditor side. The other piece that I'm trying to stress to legislators, so this was a member brief that was shared by Standard & Poor's, which is a credit rating agency. And it says, potential for property tax reform. Property taxes are a foundational credit strength for Ohio schools, given their relative stability as a source of revenue. In response to double-digit appraisal increases, state legislators are exploring property tax reform legislation, potentially leading to reduced property revenues for school districts, which could materially affect our view of school districts' institutional framework and revenue and expenditure balance. So what does this mean? Standard & Poor's, Moody's is another rating agency that we work with. If we go out to issue bonds, they rate our credit essentially. And so we are highly rated and continue to be highly rated because of the stability of our tax revenue, because our bonds are backed by property taxes. And the conversation, I've had conversations with folks at Moody's and Standard & Poor's, is that this whole conversation around property tax reform could devalue bonds for all of Ohio's entities, not just schools, in the future, if the state legislature is willing to make these very large changes that could impact the reliability of that revenue overall. So if our bonds are valued lower, that means we pay higher interest rates, which means our community pays higher interest rates overall. Or if we're even able to sell the bonds to be able to address the projects. And just a reminder, we've last issued bonds from the 2019 ballot issue that we had that helped renovate several schools. We added secure vestibules across our district at all of our schools. We opened Minerva France and Minerva Park. We updated a lot of the parking lots and playgrounds across the district. That was a $103 million bond issue. We're part of the state's facilities program, the Expedited Local Partnership Program. We have built up over $25 million in credits with those projects that the state has not funded us for yet, because again, we're on a list with the other school districts and our turn is not up for us to be funded for those projects. And so anything that we would do facilities-wise, we'll have to do with local resources until the state pays its share of those funds as well. And our percentage is 35%. The state is supposed to share 35% of every dollar that the cost of these projects are with us.
And we don't have any semblance of an idea of when our turn would be up?
Oh, so let me tell you, I started with the district in 2018, and I worked with the Ohio Facilities Construction Commission in my previous district. And so I reached out to the folks that I knew from there, and I asked them, I was like, hey, when will Westerville? And they're like, oh, you're probably about 6 or 7 years out. And I was like, oh, okay. So then in 2020, I reached out to them. They said, oh, you're probably about 6 or 7 years out. And this last year, we reached out to them. What did they say? Probably about 6 or 7 years. Yeah. So no, I don't know. I do know that the state has been putting more money into help fund some of those projects and stuff. But again, Westerville Schools hasn't had that opportunity yet. So we continue to.
Where does that money come from?
It's from the state's appropriation budget, their capital budget.
Okay, and are they just not funding that at an appropriate level? Like,
So-
why is it continuously 6 to 7 years?
They fund, so there's a couple of things. All 600 plus districts are on a ranked list based on our per pupil evaluation. So as our property values go up compared to other schools and their property values, we'll move down the list a little bit farther. So there's that. There's also, with the capital appropriations, the state will budget a portion for the Ohio Facilities Construction Commission. And then school districts have 18 months to raise their local portion of that once they're in that classroom facilities assistance program. And so some schools might be able to raise their local portion if they pass their bond issue or whatever it is they're doing, however they're funding it. And then some schools might not be successful, and then they go back and they have to keep recycling through until we get on, until our turn comes up on that list. I think they told us last time there was like 21 or 22 districts in front of us. Yeah. So, and they're funding, I think, about 5 districts a year. So, and depending on if they can get their funding, depending how much the state appropriates.
About 5 districts a year out of 400 and some?
600 plus, yeah. Well, and a lot of districts have already been funded. Like where I grew up in Scioto County, my 8th grade year, I think it was, we got a new high school and a new elementary school, and they renovated the old high school into the middle school, and that was part of the classroom facilities program. So that was also another part of the Durolf decision. The state started putting more money into capital funds for schools for that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So it's been going on for a while. So
I have a really good question. If I'm remembering correctly, and I may not be right, was private schools, are they able to get some of that funding now too?
Yeah, so the state started appropriating some funds for private schools.
So maybe we're getting bumped, right,
It's a possibility.
for some of these private schools too.
Yeah, I think-
And I know President Huffman told me that he was going to take $4 million
Mhm.
and build some private schools with our public funding, and that's what he did.
Yep. He sure did. So just a reminder, we have a cash balance and reserve policy. We developed it with our district finance committee. Requires 90-day unreserved cash for each year of the 5-year forecast period, and it triggers action by the board, superintendent, and treasurer if that benchmark's not met. And you've seen these slides before. I just wanted to share them again, just sort of level set. We implemented a budget stabilization, which is 5% of preceding year revenues, and that's just a reserve in the fund that's still in our cash balance. It doesn't accumulate year over year. It's not accounted for separately. It's included in the 5-year forecast. And you can see that budget stabilization reservation there. So what we're talking about tonight, this is one of the funds, the special fund, the termination benefits fund. It sounds funny, but under Ohio law, our collective bargaining agreements and board policy, we have severance payments that we pay to employees upon retirement or payout for vacation. And then we have 26 pay periods a year, so we pay payroll biweekly. So every 10 years about, because of the calendar shift, we end up having a 27th pay period in a fiscal year. Now we do spread out contract salaries over 27 pays instead of 26 pays to help account for that so that we're not overpaying people. But once every 10th year, we have that irregular 27th pay. So that's what this fund is for. That's what this fund exists for, is to help districts kind of plan for those somewhat large expenses in the future and build up reserves for that. This fund can be rescinded in whole or in part at any time. And I do have some numbers on here that we'll go over in just a minute for that. And then the other special fund is the Capital Projects Fund. Again, this is allowed under Ohio Revised Code. And this will allow for us to accumulate resources for the acquisition, construction, or improvement of fixed assets, including motor vehicles. And this fund or the termination benefits fund is not included in the 5-year forecast. They are accounted for separately from the general fund. So, and then they must be obligated within 10 years. And again, the fund may be rescinded in whole or in part if needed. Just a reminder, this is what we did as part of the bond issue last year. We created a capital projects fund. We transferred $30 million. We had $170 million in need. We were able to, we would have been able to have bonds that would generate $140 million without additional millage from our community. And so we put that with the bond issue, that we would have been able to address those projects. But since that bond issue failed with the operating levy back in November, the board rescinded that capital projects fund. We've since moved that money back to the general fund, and that's where it sits today, is in the general fund. During the last, I think it was the forecast presentation, might have been the board meeting before that, I shared a video clip of Representative Dave Thomas. He is a state rep that is out of the Ashtabula and Trumbull County area. He is spending a lot of time working on legislation for property tax reform. And so he has been very vocal, as have other legislators, and Senate President Rob McCauley held a press conference when they introduced the Senate's version of the budget with Senate Finance Chair Jerry Serino, and they talked about how schools should be allocating and reserving those funds if they have a use for them, and that they shouldn't be sitting in the general fund. And so that's the conversation that we're having today. Just a reminder, we had a whole committee that met during calendar year 2024. It was the Joint Committee on Property Tax Review and Reform. So a joint committee means that we had House members and Senate members that worked together. They met for hours and hours at a time over calendar year 2024. And a lot of really just, if you're really into this and want to learn about property taxes in Ohio, it's a great series of hearings to listen to. And I appreciated the members on the committee. They asked a lot of thoughtful and intentional questions. And they released their report, their final report, on December 31st, 2024. There's, I think, 21 or 22 recommendations, about 2.5 pages. Nowhere in that document is a cash cap or clawback. So I just want to make sure everybody's aware of that. They had a whole committee that met, and that was nowhere in that report. So I continue to remind our legislators of that as well. And I think that report is actually linked on this graphic too, if you want to click on it and look at it later. Before we talk about levy types, let's talk real quick about the transfers. I think that would probably be a good conversation to have before we get into that. So this rather large spreadsheet that you have in front of you, and I apologize, this was too big to include on a slide. I will ask Jennifer to have this up on board docs so that people can see this. But if you start sort of like in the big list under capital projects fund, down towards the bottom of the spreadsheet, all of those areas: technology, business operations for professional and technical services, replacement equipment, contract repairs, secondary curriculum for equipment, instructional software and textbooks, elementary curriculum for instructional software and music equipment and recorders. These are all things that are currently in our budget, in our 5-year forecast. They're currently being paid for and funded out of our general operating fund. All of these things can be paid for out of the capital projects fund, as long as they have a useful life cycle of 5 years or more. They can be considered a fixed asset and be paid for out of that fund. And then I've just totaled those by category below that. It was helpful for me. I don't know why I did that. But anyway, just so you know what that is. And then above that is the termination benefits fund for what we have projected to pay in severance. So you can see on average we pay about $1.3 million a year out in severance. Now that will change, ebb and flow, depending on retirements, changes in the retirement system, like all of those things. We've seen a lot of changes to our retirement systems, so those numbers will shift based on that. But essentially, what I've done is I've taken the first 5 years, so 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30, totaled those up. And then I carried them up top to that. If you look at the termination benefits fund where it says general transfers out, that total is $6.6 million. So that's what I'm proposing that we transfer out of the general fund from the balance to go into that termination benefits fund. And then I'm proposing that we remove the expenses from the general fund and start paying the severance out of that fund over the next 5 years. Does that make sense? Okay. And then for the capital projects fund, now if you look at that big list down at the bottom, you can see that total for 2026 is $4.75 million that we're projected to spend out of the general fund. And then that total for the 10 years, that capital projects fund can be held up to 10 years. That total is $50.8 million. I'm not proposing that we transfer that much out of the general fund. For now, we're looking at that $40.6 million for the current year to transfer out. And then we would begin paying those expenses out of the general fund beginning next year. I want to make it clear that we've already had folks do their budgets for next year. I think what we'll look at just on the accounting side of coding those expenditures and not having everybody, I feel like it's going to be really confusing for everyone to try to work through that. Did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize it's really an accounting piece. So these are things that we're already paying for, and it's legal to pay for them out of the general fund or out of a capital or
Yes.
severance fund. And so we're just looking at accounting it differently. It really won't look different on the user end, whether it's with our leaders who are managing those funds or our ultimate student use.
Yeah. And so, and then looking at next year, we may need to transfer additional funds to get us to that amount. As you can see, we're still a little bit, we're under in 2035 there. So we'll continue to monitor that, but we may see ongoing transfers if we're looking at maintaining that cap or cash balance. And I do think that we want to consider revisiting our cash balance policy when school gets back in and I start meeting with the finance committee again. We might want to consider having a conversation because we did talk about that as part of the finance committee. And the finance committee felt like that cap balance wasn't really necessary because of the nature of school funding. And, we continue to talk about how we're sort of on a bell curve. Sometimes we get money from the state, sometimes we don't get money from the state, right? But eventually the funds, we go like this with funding. The committee had thought that cap wasn't really necessary, but given the conversation we continue to have with the state about cash balances and the cap and all of those things, I think it would be helpful if we updated our policy to reflect something that we're comfortable with. But I'd like to work with the committee on that, the finance committee, and just kind of get there, because we did have that conversation and they didn't think that that was necessary, but I just want to follow back up, I think, this next school year and see about updating that policy.
Can I ask a question real quick just about the
Yes, please.
capital projects fund? It's a 10-year provision, right, on the capital projects fund?
Yeah, so what it says is it must be obligated within 10 years.
Obligated, okay. Just didn't have the language in my head. Okay.
That's in
And,
statute.
yeah, and just, I'm just thinking through the mechanics, right, of that. Right, so say we move 40 million over. That means that we have to use or obligate 40 million in the next 10 years. We can then add 7 million next year, and it's like a rolling 10 years, right? Okay.
Yeah, and we would account for it basically on like a first in, first out.
Yeah, first out. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep, okay, thanks.
And not that we actually wouldn't need that money for capital improvement projects, but if we were to need some of that money, we can pull it back out at any
Yes,
time.
so so we're moving the expenses with it. So we are definitely going to use the funds. I think that if, something happened and we wouldn't need to worry about that cash cap. I mean, it's really just moving the balance
Sure.
and the expenses out of the general fund and accounting for it in a separate fund. Overall, it doesn't change the financial picture of our district. The cash balance is something that we have available to us now, but that will deplete over time. This isn't an ongoing revenue source for us. And so I think that this probably adds complication and makes it seem like that might be an ongoing revenue source, which just adds confusion to everything. I think it was much more clear in the forecast that you could see we have this cash balance now as our revenues and expenses aren't keeping up with our expenses. That cash balance is going to decline over time. But eventually, if we transfer this money out, we'll continue to pay for those expenses out of the other fund as that balance is still there. But once that balance is gone, all of those expenses will we'll have to adjust somehow, or they'll all come back to the general fund. And I don't think that there's a world where we cannot buy technology for a year or replacement equipment or contracted repairs. Textbooks and instructional materials, that's why we're here, is to educate kids. So I think that would be difficult to completely eliminate those expenses.
Because I love bad analogies with personal finance. It's a little bit like deciding you're going to open a savings account and you're going to pay your car payment and your mortgage out of it,
Yeah,
right? Same money, same expense. You just moved it over here,
yeah.
right? So it's not extra money. You're not hiding it. You still
Yeah.
have a plan to use it.
So it's sort of like if you think about, while this is a large amount all at once, but you can think of it like the car payment piece. Maybe I have a certain amount taken out of my check and put into a savings account every 2 weeks, but my car payment only comes out once a month. So I'm building up that amount to pay that payment. And that's essentially what this is doing.
And I think, just to be blunt and call the elephant out in the room, we've always had this money in there with the intention of using it for these purposes, but our legislators don't trust that that's our purpose. So we're just making it crystal clear through accounting practices so that we don't have the resources that have already been provided by our taxpayers to pay for these things taken away.
Yeah. So that's this very large spreadsheet. Like I said, I'll post it later so that they have it on board docs. I would like to kind of shift gears to levy conversation.
Before we go there, Nicole, so we're going to move this. Are we going to revisit this the next?
Oh, I'm sorry. We'll have a resolution on the June 23rd agenda.
Thank you.
Yeah, I apologize for that. Thank you for
Thank you.
mentioning that. Excuse me. This slide was on our forecast presentation. Just a reminder of the different levy types. So schools, we have the ability to ask our community for property tax levies. There's various iterations of that, or income tax levies. And again, this is just for income taxes. We can only ask for residents, tax on the income of residents, but we aren't able to ask for, like, a city might be able to tax an income tax for people who work in their city. That's not the case for a school district income tax. The school district income tax only applies to residents of the school district, and it would apply to all residents of the school district.
And just to be clear, we've never passed an income tax.
No, we have not passed an income tax. We have not had a standalone income tax on the ballot in a few decades, I think, at least a couple of decades. I'd have to pull that up. But the last time we had an income tax, I think, was 2011, and it was combined with a property tax at that time. And I think it's probably been a while since any school district has passed a new income tax, honestly. And this is the conversation that the legislators are having. There was a, what do they call it? Property Tax Relief Act, something, House Bill 335. So some legislators have put together multiple bills in the name of property tax relief. And they've combined a lot of those bills into the House Bill 335. They had a press conference, it was about 33 minutes long, that they held the other day. It was House Ways and Means Chair, House Representative Member Romer, and Thomas is the Vice Chair. And they talked about wanting to provide property tax relief, and I believe it was Thomas that said, we told schools 6 months ago that they needed to diversify their revenue. And they are proposing eliminating the inside millage that we receive. So for us, on residential tax rates, about 39 mils, inside millage is about 38 of that, 3.8 of that, excuse me, less than 10% of that. And that would go away. That's about a little over 16 million a year for us if that were to go through the way that it is. And that's set by the state constitution. So lots of conversations to be had around that. But in the press conference, and what I hear legislators continue to say is that schools should not continually go back for property taxes and that they should be asking their community for income tax levies. We don't have the ability to ask for a sales tax or anything like that. So we can lobby the state for more funding through the school funding formula, or we can ask our community for additional funding to keep pace with inflationary increases that we're seeing in the cost of educating children. Those are really our options.
I just want to point out in passing that the inside mills are the only mills that House Bill 920 does not apply to.
Yes.
So they want to get rid of the millage when property values go up, that's the only millage where we get increased collections.
Yes.
And that's the part they want to get rid of,
Yes.
just to be clear.
Yes. So just a reminder, property taxes are levied on all real estate located within the district's boundaries. It's not exempted. House Bill 920 limits growth on all voted tax levies. So as values go up, the county auditor reduces tax rates. So the revenue that the district receives remains generally the same on those voted levies. And municipalities are able to limit or exempt growth on new construction. So that happens through economic development tools like tax incentive financing programs or community reinvestment areas through tax abatements. And we continue to have lots of conversations about those. For income taxes, schools can ask their community for a tax levied on income of all residents. So that's anyone residing within the district boundaries. And I keep hearing that renters don't pay property taxes. I think they do through rent, but just a reminder that even if you are renting, if you live in the district and you're gainfully employed receiving an income, you would be subject to your employer is required to withhold school district income tax. And it can be based only on earned income. So there's a traditional income and then there's an earned income. And traditional is basically a tax on all income, and earned income is just wages. It doesn't apply to retirement income, investment earnings, or anything like that, or unemployment income. And income taxes are subject to the ebb and flow of the economy. So if incomes go up, we would see growth in those revenues. If incomes go down, we would see declines in those revenues. It's subject to that ebb and flow. Property taxes, because those amounts, when we pass a property tax levy, the county certifies the amount that levy will collect, and it will continue to adjust the rates as values go up, down, so that we collect that same amount year over year. And then if values go down, tax rates will go up, but only to the voted rate. So our last levy was 5.9 mils, operating levy was 5.9 mils. It's probably collecting around 3.5 mils today, probably lower than that with 2023 reappraisals. But if values went up, that might bump up a little bit, but it would never go above 5.9 mils. So that's just kind of how that works. So just a note about those. And then I shared this also. This is from Legislative Services Commission. This was a member brief released February 4th, 2025. This just shows what school districts have income taxes. And then it highlights county boundaries too. So just a note, and I wish I would have pointed us out. So we are right there. Can you see us? That white. So Big Walnut, I think, is this district up here. It's hard to get that straight from this far back. So you can see where we are. Lots of schools have income taxes around the state.
Sorry, quick question. Just to clarify on the earned income, is it, so it's earned, but is it W-2 income only? Or, I mean, what are the different sources of, you know what I mean?
Well, it might be, it would probably be business, if
Business
you
income.
are in the district, yeah. I think it would apply to that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. What was I going to say about that? Oh, the timing. I'll talk about that on this slide. When we look at revenue generated, so income taxes versus property taxes. So income taxes, we can only ask for increments of 0.25%. So a traditional income tax, 0.25%, would generate about $10.4 million a year. Earned income would be about 8.7. So you can see those differences with those different increments down the table. And then property taxes, a mill for us is about 4.3 million. That's based on our assessed values at the county. And you can see what 2 mills, 3 mills, 4 mills, 5 mills, 6 mills.
Nicole, for the estimates here on the income taxes, is that based on approximately what people in the district are making now, like this year?
Yeah, so I got these numbers from the Department of Taxation. They give us these estimates. They said that they will be updating those income tables sometime this month.
Okay.
And so that may change in the future, but they acted like it wouldn't be a huge change
How often do they update them?
once a year.
Okay. So
And
annually?
One thing to point out too is there is pending legislation that would be capped at a 1% that we would be able to ask for.
Yes, that is true. Also, just a reminder, the timing. So property taxes follow a tax year. So if we were on the ballot in November that would be for tax year 2025, we would start seeing collections in calendar year 2026, which would mean we'd see a half year of collections in fiscal year 26 and then a full year beginning in 27. For an income tax, there is an 18-month sort of phase-in window. And so we wouldn't realize, it would sort of be a little wonky for those until that 18-month time period, and we could realize full collections going forward. So just a note about that. I think this is my last slide. Yeah, it is. So I want to turn it over to Carrie because I just want to make sure that the board's aware and that our community is aware. When we talk about capital projects, so this capital projects fund, we're essentially taking things that we would already be paying for out of our general fund, just for general upkeep, anything that would be a fixed asset that we would normally pay for out of our general fund, to shift into that fund and to pay for that. But we have overall hundreds of millions of dollars of capital needs that we have no funding for. And so I want Carrie to share some information with us about that.
You sound great.
Yeah.
They put us together.
So the information in front of you is just put together some deferred project considerations that we have on the operation side of the house. It includes in our IT world a one-to-one technology plan in which there's been a lot of discussion and desire to have this opportunity for our students. It also includes continuing the teaching wall upgrades at the 6 elementary school buildings remaining to be done. So all of our secondary buildings have been completed. At the elementary level, the buildings that have been renovated have had this upgrade done. So these are the 6 buildings that remain at the elementary schools that currently have a setup very similar to this. It also includes upgrades to our server switchgear infrastructure, security panel replacements. All of these things are general preventative maintenance and or replacement cycles on equipment. So we're going to need to do some of these things soon, but we've deferred them as we deal with available funding. We have what we have. Additionally, on here included are the numbers that were part of the bond project that was not successful in November. So you have numbers on here for Charrington, Huber. I apologize, Huber's on here twice. One of those should say Robert Frost. My apologies. So Charrington, Huber Ridge, Blendon, and Walnut Springs were the buildings that we discussed with the levy. But to remember that the facility master plan was originally to include all 6 of those buildings, plus Westerville North back in 2019 when the facility master plan was adopted. So all of those numbers were provided by Elford in their March of 2024 proposal for that work, which is how we decided to move forward with the 6 buildings that were on that ask. So you see those numbers there. Those numbers do not include the inflationary rates we've seen since then either, so take that into consideration. You will see 2 numbers for Westerville North. It's a renovation and partial replacement of the building and or full replacement of the building. And to understand, with OFCC, the Expedited Local Partnership Program that Nicole mentioned earlier, if a building hits 2/3 rule, and what that is that the cost of renovation becomes 2/3 of what the replacement value is, they will recommend you replace the building. So that's why both of those numbers are included. That's not a decision that's been made, but both of those numbers are included. We also talk about roofing projects, oftentimes much like at home. Just because the shingles have a 50-year life cycle, when it becomes time to replace them, you can work with a roofing company to determine if now's the time or not. So we do have some deferred roofing projects that we are aware of. Our high school theater renovations, those were part of the ask in November. If anybody has spent any time in our 3 different high school theaters, we know that it is time to make some investment in some of them more so than others, but everybody needs some attention, and that's the numbers you see there. Those spaces are as much used for our school events as they are for our community. So we keep those on a rolling plan as we can address needs as they come along. Parking lot and playground resurfacing and preventative maintenance. We've done a really good job with those bond funds of addressing some of our parking lots as we've been able to. As everybody knows, there's a lot of asphalt in this district. We have nearly 30 buildings and lots of parking lots that surround them. The other thing that we are seeing with a growing special needs population in our schools, we need to address our playground surfaces as well, and our access to the equipment along with the equipment, the playground equipment that's out there as well. Balcony enclosures at McVeigh, Wilder, and Heritage Middle School, we actually deferred that project this year as well. We're looking at safety enclosures for those spaces, along with helping with the sound. When those buildings were constructed, there are classrooms that face those open spaces. And so when you have lunch going on or an assembly going on, it can be very disruptive for the rest of the building. That would help at all 3 of those locations. Always plumbing and electrical infrastructure upgrades. Again, think about your home. Everything has to be addressed at some point. We do things as they become urgent. Remember, our goal is always warm, safe, and dry. Building envelopes, preventative maintenance. So these are buildings that have to be cared for. So you're looking at, we've spent, the board has approved the ceiling of some of our split block out surface of our buildings. We've had some envelopes where the roof and the building meet that have had to be addressed. Some masonry work, things that need to be done. I believe it's Genoa that's getting done this summer. We did Central last. So not fancy things, but necessary to maintain our buildings. And then we've identified, so with the Westerville South project coming, getting wrapped up, what was bid and presented to the community back in 2019, we've lived in it. The students have attended, the teachers have worked through that. We're very grateful for that, but we've identified additional needs that that building has. It would be an additional project. So you'll see that number on there as well. So grand total for all of the things that I've gone through, $365,195,424 if you renoed north. Those are some big numbers, but those are deferred projects. If you look at just the project outside of the facility master plan, so everything else that I mentioned outside of the facility master plan, that's 27.5 million almost in projects of just deferred projects that we can do if we had the funding to do so.
So I just want to remind everybody that in addition to these projects, we also have permanent improvement levies and a fund that pays for ongoing building repairs and maintenance and school repairs. So what Doug presented to us tonight with the tracks, that's being paid for out of our permanent improvement levy dollars. And that generates roughly a little over $9 million a year through those levies.
Those permanent improvement not only does some of the projects in which you heard, like track replacements, we will HVAC projects, just depends on what the project needs are, urgent needs for that year. But we also pay for our buses and our MyVan replacements. Our buses are on a 14-year replacement cycle. Our MyVans are on a 7. Custodial equipment replacement, gotta keep the buildings clean. Our maintenance vehicles, AV upgrades, musical equipment replacement. It's also an important thing that we do with our permanent improvement dollars. Furniture replacement as well. So we make those dollars go pretty far considering just for footage.
And Carrie, just to put in perspective, when we talk about 9 million in PI funds roughly a year, what do we typically have in HVAC a year, and how many buildings does that cover? Just to kind of give the scope of that, and or maybe the roofing, just to kind of put some context to those numbers when we're talking about taking care of 30 different facilities across the district.
So you heard Doug mention that we have about $4 million in HVAC projects a year right now. It varies by building. It's hard to say like we do 4 or 5 buildings a year because it depends on the age of the unit and the time that it needs to replace it. So a building like South can have 10 units on the roof, and they're not all going to need replaced at the same time. You have a smaller building like Emerson, you might have 3 or 4 units that need to be replaced. So we probably have 4 to 5 projects a year, and you spend about $4 million right now. And you think about the cost of that equipment and the inflationary rates and what's coming in the near future potentially with our tariffs, those costs are only going to grow. Roofing, about $1.5 million a year in roofing projects, also with parking lots as well.
So probably over half of that money between roofing and HVAC just are regularly scheduled replacement cycles for all the buildings we have.
Correct.
So that money doesn't last long, I guess is the point I wanted to make. So as we look at the other things that need done, we have to make a lot of choices.
We do.
And I just want to note, because I did ask our logistics department about the cost of a school bus. Do you have that? Do you want to share that?
I do. So our cost of a school bus, 2020, 5 years ago. I'm sorry, 2022. It was $105,245. FY26, we are planning for a standard school bus, so not one with a wheelchair lift, at $152,153.66. Our MyVans, when we started the program in 2018, we were spending $37,000 on MyVans. We're planning to spend, I like numbers. We're not planning to spend what we're required to spend now. It's costing us $75,000 a van.
That 37 was just one.
One. Per per vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
They have doubled.
And those vehicles are paid for out of that PI fund. And there's, like she said, we have the schedules that we have them on, so there's different amounts paid. How many did we buy this? I feel like I just signed off on like 12 or,
It was 12 and 25. We have 16 being replaced this FY '26. That's the plan, is to replace 16 buses
Yeah.
each year and 7 My Vans.
And I think you've mentioned this before, but that replacement cycle is really determined by maintenance costs and like hitting that sweet spot, right, of where we're spending more to fix things, and it makes more sense at that point to replace.
And that really does come into play with the My Vans. We're able to maximize a trade-in value and get every bit of the warranty while we have it. Anything outside of that, you're looking at increased mechanic costs as well as things that we have to send out for the warranty work to be, or then what would have been warranty work to be completed. Everything else we can handle in-house within that 7 years on the My Van with our very talented and dedicated mechanics that we have over at Transportation. Same with our buses.
so if I'm looking at this correctly, so not counting what we're already addressing with our PI funds on an annual basis, which isn't really a ton, but we still have over $300 million worth of just needs for our facilities that's been identified today.
Yeah, and that includes our facility master plan.
And how often do we look at the facility master plan and update?
So this last cycle was on a 5-year. So as we approached the first 5 years, we started looking at the buildings that were identified in the second 5 years of the facility master plan. That's also when we identified we needed to move out of a 10-year plan. Just the cost, the inflationary rate of cost of construction and the renovations itself had grown, was it 32% on average? So we knew we had to amend what we thought we were initially going to be able to do within a 10-year period. Our buildings will continue to age. There is a gap between the facility master plan identified buildings and the next set of buildings until they turn that age 50 to 55 that we start to look at renovation. I think it's about 14 years that we really have a gap in there before we had the buildings that were built in the 80s.
So I think, my point in wanting to have this conversation is to just share, to make sure that everybody understands, and I just want to make sure that it's open and transparent, that our cash balance wouldn't be enough to address the needs of the district that we do have. We are using our cash balance to continue operations as best that we can. Our revenues are not keeping pace with inflationary increases on any level. And so, we are at a point to where we need to ask our community for more money. We need the state to fund its share of education, or we need to make some really serious, significant cuts to our, I'm talking closing buildings and significantly reducing services overall to our students.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, Carrie, and everyone. Thinking about all of this, and what would you recommend?
I think we need to have an understanding of what we're comfortable with, where our revenues and expenses are upside down by over $20 million a year. We need to generate $20 million a year at least, more year over year. I think that if we asked for an income tax levy, I think we would probably be at about 0.75% to be able to keep up, especially when you figure in that 18-month window, and whether that's in November or if that conversation happens in next year. in the spring or in the fall. We have to take that into account. And then for property taxes, I mean, we probably need to be at around close to 6 mils, 5 to 6 mils, depending on.
And if we went with an income tax, an earned income tax or an income tax, a traditional, when do we need to do we need to make a resolution next
Yeah,
board
so
meeting or
if we wanted to be on the ballot this November, we would have to have a resolution for property taxes by the June 23rd, the next board meeting, June 23rd, to be certified by the county. And then we would come back with the second resolution in July. And that has to be filed by I think it's August 6th is the deadline.
Yeah.
It's the same as candidate petitions. Everything's due by that date. For income taxes, the resolution would have to be approved in July and still have that same August 6th deadline. There's only the one resolution to the Department of Taxation. So I guess I should clarify the 0.75% would be if it were an earned income. If we looked at a traditional income, I mean, because it's only 0.25% increment, it would, I mean, I wouldn't go above 0.5%, but that would be tight, I think, as we're looking at things moving forward. And I think that we would, if we're on the ballot in November, or whenever we're on the ballot again, I think we would need to have a very clear conversation with our community and with our board about what we would have to look at, where we would need to make reductions if it weren't successful.
I know, I mean, we have to make some decisions, right? I worry that, I know we don't know what's coming from the state whatsoever, but we can't wait around for that either. We have to move forward, and I think we have to be on the ballot in November. I guess for me, that's just where I am. I'm trying to figure out which is a better avenue, right? And I do like this earned income idea because it doesn't harm the poor. It doesn't harm people that maybe are living on a retirement budget, or maybe are unemployed. I do like that aspect of it.
Regarding not knowing what we're going to get from the state, I think everybody understands how this works, but let's just be clear, it's not going to be better than the Senate version. Right,
Yeah.
the House and Senate are going to conference,
So I
so
think
it's not, there's no magic in there.
I'm not aware of any magic that's left. But so Senator Jerry Serino is the chair for the Senate Finance Committee. And during testimony with OASBO, Katie Johnson, the executive director of OASBO, he said the Senate's version is the best version you get, and you better get on board with it. So what I've shared with our legislators, local and abroad, is that our district will continue to thoughtfully plan and try to make decisions that will have minimal impact on students as best that we can. But at the end of the day, I think that it's up to our community, and we have to remember that our schools belong to our community. This is, what does our community want for its school system? You all represent our community at this level, and so I think it's ultimately where we think we need to be.
So from a timing standpoint, I think just quite bluntly, what it comes down to is, we've talked before, we have cash. We're living off our savings account. Sorry. We can either spend it down more before we go on the ballot, but then if we don't pass, it's critical and we're cutting immediately a lot. Or we try now when we still have a little bit of runway. But there's a confusion piece, right, where we have to try to educate people, don't always understand the difference between a deficit and what is in our cash balance and the fact that the cash balance is depleting.
And now that we're making transfers, I think that is just going to be wholly confusing for everybody. So, and I want to make it very clear that these transfers will not impact any levy need. It's just shifting where we're paying
accounting.
for stuff from. It's just accounting for things differently. It does not affect our levy timing. Our revenues are not keeping up with our expenses. So we either need to increase our revenues or we need to reduce our expenses. And there is no, like, that's just how that math works.
Which that's not new. That's why we were on the ballot in the fall.
Right.
And we were obviously unsuccessful. So fortunately, at that point, we did have a cash balance. And so we have made some austerity measures, but we're not at this like devastating cut level. Again, the longer we wait to go back on. So the decision now is, do we put something on in November? Do we wait until next calendar year? The longer we wait, the more, if it doesn't pass, we're going to have to cut. So that's kind of the discussion and the point that, you all have to decide on.
Well, in particular, if you're talking income tax with the 18-month, we can't wait until next year and then have another 18 months.
That puts us out a little bit.
Yeah, it's a long ways out.
The hard piece is, again, I'm just in a really candid mood tonight, is that the legislators and the narrative that they've told around this budget puts us in a really difficult place of trying to secure additional revenue, because they're trying to tell a story that we have money we don't need. I think we've demonstrated tonight we need more than what we have, but that's not the narrative that they've been telling the public. So we are combating that, and that's going to be a difficult piece for us.
Well, I mean, I think we need to, we've talked about this so much, right? We've continued to talk about it. I know, I could go back and watch all of these videos if I wanted to. I would hope that our community would watch, listen, share, and combat that. And I feel like the more people I'm talking to out and about, they're starting to actually really talk about these things, like they're listening. And so I feel that we just need to continue to do that. I guess my question is, if we went with an earned income tax, we aren't able to collect for 18 months. Does that harm us? Do we have to make any cuts as a result of that? Or we're going to say we don't know what's happening at the state level. And so, there's that precautionary.
So I think at the 0.75% and taking into account the 18-month window, I think that we don't know what the state budget's going to do. Regardless of any school funding formula, it's never going to be enough to make up the $20+ million shortfall in revenue. I think that I think it's just going to get harder the longer that we wait. The property tax piece, like I said, that's always a year behind. So the 25 collection in 26 because of that tax year. So it's really what I guess makes sense for our community. And when you think about our community, we have a very large disparity in wealth in our community, from property values to income. I don't know. I mean, I wish I knew what made sense. I wish we had a reliable school funding formula. I wish that the state would do its part and we would know what we have coming our way year over year. I wish that we had a revenue source that would keep up with inflation increases, at least provide for some inflationary increases. I just, I think the timing with the 18-month window, I think we would be fine with the 0.75% overall. But, and as I've said, that is going to ebb and flow with the economy and those incomes. So if incomes go down, that revenue will go down. If incomes go up, that revenue will increase. So, and I'm not saying if we pass an income tax levy, we will never need another tax levy. I want to make that very clear. We are going to continue to have to go back to our voters in the future if we see large increases in need without adequate funding that we've seen historically.
Or, for example, the inside millage goes away.
Inside
there are
millage, that's
legislative
another
things that could
$16
happen.
million if that were to go away. And you know, when we have conversations about economic development and the tax abatements and the TIFs and all of those things, like all of that has the ability to impact our potential for growth and revenue going forward. So it's just a conversation we'll have to continue to have over and over again.
In terms of, so if we were talking about an earned income tax in terms of, what rate, I think for me, what is the July, what meeting we would have to,
It's the only meeting we have in July. It's July the 9th, I
Ninth?
think.
July 9th, okay. So I guess it doesn't really matter. I mean, the
7th.
state will probably sign a budget June 30th. There've been a couple times when it's crept into July, which is why just want to make sure. it
Yeah,
wasn't-
so a couple bienniums ago, they did a temporary measure for the first couple weeks in July.
Yep.
I mean, I don't know, they seem to be getting these passed
Yeah, it
through
doesn't-
pretty quickly. It doesn't seem
It
to
doesn't
be-
seem like that's where we're going to end up.
Doesn't
but-
seem like it.
But for me, the question is, I mean, there is a pretty big difference between where the House is right now and where the Senate is.
Yep.
So like, if we knew we were going to be where the Senate is, I would say, okay, I'm thinking 3/4. But if we end up closer where the House is, the timing works out well for us to consider it might need to be higher than that.
Yeah.
So we will know. That was the whole point in waiting. We will know. And then if we decide that it's the way I would lean is earned income, but where that rate needs to end, I need to see where we end up. And it fortunately works out. We can wait and see.
Yeah.
Yeah, and these will be adjusted slightly too, once the Department of Taxation gets their numbers updated. He didn't give me any particular date on that. He said it just should be sometime this month. So before we'd have that, if we're looking at income taxes, we would have some updated numbers before the board would consider that resolution. Property taxes, like I said, if we want to be on for property taxes, we would have to have the first round of legislation by the 23rd, the next meeting.
And just, this might be a dumb question, but the income tax, if we were to pass an earned income tax, that doesn't have like a sunset date. It's not like this will be an income tax for 15 years and then it goes
would
away.
be, we would do it continuing. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we had a 4.9 mil levy on the ballot in November because we needed it. It's not like those needs mysteriously
We've since
disappeared.
We've since made a lot of cuts. I
Yeah.
mean, we have eliminated over 30 positions in the district, and I like to remind people that we didn't have 33 people sitting around doing nothing in
Yeah.
this district. That means a lot of people are doing a lot more with less. I think that, we've heard conversations about class sizes and all of those things, but I think if we're going to have to continue to make cuts if we don't see additional revenues in the future.
And the needs are all still there.
We did this, we talked about this in the fall, and I think we did a good job today talking about, projected projects, what we're spending overall. But could you remind us what the dollar amount is in terms of our expenditures on a day-to-day basis, district-wide? Like per day, how much are we spending?
We spend over $600,000 a day,
So that's a lot of money.
and
when
that's
you
based
add
on a
that up.
365-day year. So that's not just the 180 days that school's open.
Thank you.
So I kind of feel like we need to have an understanding of where we all are, right? Because our next meeting is the 23rd. Like Jen, I think it's, for me, I've already said, I'm leaning towards earned income. I do believe we need to be on the ballot in November. I do appreciate that we have that ability to say, is it 0.75 or is it 1, knowing what we get back from the General Assembly. But I'm just curious as to where you two are.
Yeah, I know we discussed this earlier in the week. I think I'm the type of person I like to weigh out the pros and cons. For me, I think from today to the end of the week, it'll be connecting with community members, really understanding, making sure that we're taking into account what their needs are, how do they feel about this, so that I can make a final judgment. But right now, I think I am definitely leaning towards the earned income option.
I'm I'm in the same spot. I mean, we needed the money last November. The reason we punted from May was so that we could, like you said, understand what's coming down the pike from the state legislative budget, as well as if there were going to be any significant impacts federally. I don't know that we have a good necessarily understanding of the federal piece quite yet, but we will at least know the state budget piece by the end of this month. I don't foresee them taking longer than they need to. I do think the income tax piece is interesting because one of the things that we do hear quite a bit, especially from older property owners, community members, is that they're being essentially taxed out of their homes because it's all property taxes all the time. So the earned income piece would kind of alleviate that from those adults who prefer to age in place, because this would not be taxing their retirement, income. So that's an interesting, I think, avenue to look at with this. And it does give us the flexibility to understand what we do need to raise. I would be shocked if there was a bunch of community members out there who were like, no, please increase my property taxes. But, nobody wants to pay taxes, period, but services require money.
So, I'm sorry, are you both thinking November too? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Just want to add the last piece about property taxes is there's so much conversation and, we see this about property tax reform and what is that really going to mean, that I take the advice to heart that we should try to diversify, our revenue streams. So I was here in 2011 when that ballot issue didn't pass. It was combined income and operating. I think we're in a very different place. And so I appreciate, again, the way this lines up and that we have the time to wait and watch and to hear from folks. But yeah, I think we've got to do something and we have to do it this fall. That's my opinion.
Okay, so I think we feel pretty comfortable with going forward in the fall with an earned income. I guess, Anissa, are you?
Yeah.
Okay, and then.
And what we're not hearing though is you want us to bring something back next meeting about property tax, and that's the big piece we need to know right now.
Yeah, and we'll know something by the end of this month as to what the state's going to do. We'll be able to make a more informed decision.
But we will miss the timeline for the property taxes.
Yeah,
I just
yeah,
want to
yeah,
make sure
yeah,
that's
yeah,
clear.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, at least what I heard was we're interested in the earned income piece of it.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, that was, thank you. Thanks for.
It's a lot. I'm sorry.
No,
I'm
but it
always
was
a lot.
all good information, and I appreciate the people that actually stayed for all of that too.